Okay, week 4 video part 2. Let me put myself down in the bottom of the screen. This is where we ended up, so it's where we'll start. A quote from Mitchell: I love how the poet, we don't know who wrote Gilgamesh, so that's why he refers to the poet, right? We have scribes who wrote down different versions of it, but the poet just refers to, uh, whichever scribe happened to be writing it down at the time. And there are many. Mitchell is working from the standard Babylonian version. So we have a name, Sinalekeun. He is the name of a scribe who organized the standard version. So, in this context, I guess the poet refers to Sinalekeun. But in some sense, the poet refers to all those scribes for many hundreds of years who've been writing down different versions of this story. I love how the poet has morally situated his poem so that as soon as we are tempted to take a position about good and evil, we realize that there is an opposite and equally valid position. This world, like ours, is not black and white. There is ultimately nowhere to stand, no side we can ultimately take and not cut ourselves off from the truth. Yes, Humbaba is a monster. Perhaps he is evil, as Ninsun says, but it's at least is true that Humbaba has his appointed place in the divine order of things. So by the end of this passage, we have a reference to the scene in Tablet 5, where Humbaba is killed. But Mitchell's point about that scene and others is that this world that the poet is showing us is not black and white. There's a moral ambiguity. This is a starting point for thinking about Gilgamesh, and you could write a whole paper in response to this kind of claim. Okay, I've already talked about this in an earlier video, so I'll move on. This also is a claim that we refers to the passage in Humbaba and beyond, but it's reading the narrative as a kind of psychological task. What is the psychological task of the hero? Well, if it is to gain mastery over the internal monsters by killing the external ones, then Gilgamesh has been radically unsuccessful. He will have to learn limits another way. So that's, again, gives you a way of reading the story, right? As sort of thinking of the hero as engaged in a psychological task. And gives you a way of reading the encounter with Humbaba, right? Humbaba is the external monster, right, that Gilgamesh is killing off, but the goal is to gain mastery over the internal monster, and he doesn't do that by killing Humbaba, right? The internal monster remains even after Humbaba is destroyed. This is one way of reading it. I'm not saying it's the best way of reading it, or certainly not the only way of reading it, but here Mitchell is giving you a way of reading a scene from the story, a scene from the poem. Book 6. Here's a passage that I did not include in the last one of the last videos. So this is a new passage from page 40 and 41 in Mitchell's introduction. It's obvious that Book 6 is a separable episode that could be omitted without any loss of continuity. That's the scene where he has the encounter with Ishtar. So this is an interesting claim, right? You could sort of engage with this kind of a claim. And this is the kind of claim that you could develop on your own by giving a close reading, right? For Mitchell, you could get rid of Book 6 and it wouldn't change the fundamental structure of the story. You wouldn't lose continuity between Book 4 and between Book 5 and Book 7. If you cut out Book 6, you wouldn't lose any continuity. Well, that's his claim. What's his evidence for that claim? Well, the heroes kill Humbaba in Book 5, and in the death of Enkidu at the end of Book 7, they suffer the results of their act. Right? Why must Enkidu die? Because he killed Humbaba. We don't really need Ishtar and the rejection of Ishtar and the insult to Ishtar by killing the bull of heaven. We don't need that episode to explain why Enkidu has to die. But, he says, so why do we need Book 6? But the progression to tragedy would seem abrupt without the Ishtar episode. He reads Book 6 as a comic interlude, right? The narrative structure is moving us toward tragedy. But in between Book 5 and Book 7, we have a comic interlude, right? Like what he calls the satyr play that we see in Greek tragedies, right? The satyrs were sort of half man, half goat, and these were plays that came in between. So the Greeks would perform plays in public theaters at certain times of year to honor the god Dionysius, the god of drama, but also the god of wine and anyway, this sort of Dionysian bacchanalic spirit. That they would celebrate Dionysius by performing plays over a 3-day period in the center of the city. The center of the city was a theater. And they would mostly be tragedies and comedies. But in between the tragedies and the comedies, they would perform satyr plays. These sort of obscene, vulgar, high-spirited, irreverent, and rambunctious plays. The satyrs themselves would also, there would be a lot of sex scenes, and there would be a lot of vulgar language. Okay, so he's reading the Ishtar scene as a kind of interlude between the tragic elements. We have a kind of comedy in between. Anyway, they're letting loose all the energies that will soon enough become contained and very somber, right? So this is an interpretation, right? The story becomes very somber, but before the somber begins, we have the kind of comic interlude with Ishtar. That's Mitchell's reading. Moving on, here's another claim. Enkidu could easily be seen as a tragic hero. Well, is he? This is something you could write about. Do you see Enkidu as a tragic hero, pulled out of his Eden into the corrupt world of humans to suffer an arbitrary death sentence from the gods? Is that how you read it? You could develop that kind of interpretation in response to Mitchell. But more accurately, Enkidu caused his own death by insisting that Gilgamesh kill Humbaba, right? Mitchell doesn't see him as a tragic hero. You could see him as a tragic hero, but the but indicates that Mitchell doesn't read it that way. From Mitchell's point of view, Enkidu caused his own death. He's responsible for his death. If they had let the monster live, all would have been well. They had a choice. They could have left the forest. They could have given Humbaba mercy. Humbaba asks for mercy. They could have given it to him. They chose not to. The fact that neither Enkidu nor Gilgamesh ever realizes this is part of the pathos of the situation. They never realize that they are responsible for what happens. At least that's Mitchell's claim. Here's another claim. The more we try to fit Gilgamesh into the pattern of the archetypal journey, the more bizarre and quirky and postmodern it seems. It's the original quest story, but also an anti-quest, since it undermines the quest myth from the beginning. I also quoted that in an earlier video, so I'll move on. Experiencing intimacy seems to be for Gilgamesh what experiencing sex is for Enkidu, an initiation into human vulnerability. For those of you who are writing about friendship and love, this might be a useful passage. Once he found the companion of his heart, Gilgamesh became, in effect, 3/3 human. He left behind his kinship with the unsleeping, undying gods, just as Enkidu left behind the 2/3 of him that was animal. Unwittingly, each gave up part of his physical strength in order to know the kind of love that an animal or a god can't know. Again, I think this is an interesting interpretation from Mitchell that might help you if you're writing about love and friendship in the poem. At the end, getting toward the end of the story, Mitchell is arguing that the episode is not meant to be a lesson in prudence. This is where he loses the herb of youth, or fails the tests that Utnapishtim sets for him. It's not meant to be a lesson in prudence. It's the end of the line for Gilgamesh's quest. He is face to face with the realization that there is no immortality and no return to youth. A realization that can result, depending on your readiness, in either despair or freedom. When there's no way out, you just follow the way in front of you. So again, he gives you a way of reading that passage. Is it a moment of despair or a moment of freedom? I think Mitchell is leaning toward the latter, right? Gilgamesh's frustration gives way to a kind of liberation. He's not going to become immortal, but that kind of frees him up in a way. He's not going to return to his youth, but that kind of frees him up in a way. Okay. Lastly, here's the final sort of sentence from Mitchell's introduction. Somehow, in the interval between story and return, Gilgamesh has become wise. He has absorbed not the conventional wisdom of a Shaduri, the tavern keeper who tried to kind of convince him to turn around and go home, or an Utnapishtim also tried to convince him, like, you know, you're running wild through the forest in search of something you're never going to get. Just go home and be a king. But he doesn't take the conventional wisdom. Right? He's earned the deeper wisdom of the poem's narrative voice, a wisdom that is impartial, humorous, civilized, sexual, irreverent, skeptical of moral absolutes, delighted with the things of this world, and supremely confident in the power of its own language. That's what Gilgamesh has become. Insofar as he's become wise, he has absorbed the wisdom of the story, right, and the voice of the poem. That's Mitchell's argument. Again, these are just examples of interpretive moves, and you could, they're meant to sort of model what I'm looking for you to do in your writing. Okay, so that's it for Mitchell. I think this is going to be a three-part video. But moving on to Genesis, because the title of this slideshow was Gilgamesh in Genesis. So let's move to Genesis and an image of the garden and Adam and Eve. Again, a European painting, a medieval European painting. Notice the animals. I think I showed this in an earlier video. The fruit, the serpent. Their private parts are covered. All the elements of the story are here. So the thematic structure from Genesis we looked at in an earlier video, the two creation stories, the garden, the Adam and Eve, and the serpent, the tree of knowledge just pictured in the previous slide, and then God's curse on the humans, followed by the image of the tree of life as the human leaves the garden, that they're sort of barred from that tree. We know they're never going to come back, because if they came back, they would eat from that tree and become gods. So they've been driven from the garden. And this is followed by the story of the first brothers, right, the first children of Adam and Eve, the brothers, and the murder, the sibling rivalry, the murder of Abel, and God's curse on Cain, which gives rise to he heads out, he's sort of banished, goes in exile, but he is the founder of the first city. And the first city, right, gives rise to civilization, but after that we have a reference, sort of small reference in chapter 5 to the birth of Noah. He's not a city dweller, right? Noah is living outside the city. He's a vegetarian. He's a gatherer, right? He's a grower of wine. We learn that he's the first cultivator of wine. Okay, but here's an image of Adam and Eve leaving the garden, being led out of the garden. A later European, this is not a medieval painting, a much later painting, representation of that moment. So moving from the first 5 chapters to the next, to 6 through 11, God sees the evil of the human and decides to wipe out the human race. And he speaks directly to Noah, sets up a covenant or a promise with Noah, instructs Noah to build the ark. Noah follows the instructions. We have the flood, which is a kind of reverse creation moment, right? Everything that we see in Genesis 1 and 2 is reversed when the flood comes. And then importantly, Noah builds an altar. This is similar in some ways to, the mourning for the loss of Enkidu, right? Gilgamesh doesn't build an altar, but he piles up an offering, right? On an altar. But Noah builds an altar in the middle of nowhere. And this is an important moment because it is followed by God's promise not to send another flood. It's not until Noah builds the altar that God makes this promise. Interesting connection. And we have the kind of permission to eat animal flesh. So it's sort of after the flood that the human begins to eat flesh. Prior to that, the assumption is that the human is only eating, is a vegetarian, or anyway. I mean, there's this at least permission. I think we have to assume that the human is eating flesh before that. But right, this is the moment where God permits that, but at the same time prohibits murder. Right, so don't spill the blood of the human. You can spill the blood of the animal, but you must cook the animal before you eat the animal. Right? So it's interesting. I mean, if you read Leviticus, there's all sorts of rules. The book of Leviticus, which comes later, all sorts of rules for how to eat. But this is the beginning of God sort of laying down some kind of rules. God gives a sign of covenant, right? The rainbow, And that's the symbol that the flood will not come again. And then we